I'd like to welcome you to our first event of 2021, and it's also the first event in our conversation series this year. I'm Mike Rupert, president of the Richard Wagner Society of the Upper Midwest. As I said, we have a rather large group of you zooming in with us today. We have participants from the US, literally from sea to shining sea. We have people from that great country to the north, Canada. We have someone even from across the pond in London and from as far away as Sydney, Australia, where it is 6 a.m. tomorrow. If you're not yet a member of our Wagner Society, please consider joining us. We have members from as far away as Sweden, and we not only have some great events already scheduled for this spring, but we also have an exciting fall season in the planning stages right now. I'll be happy to apply your registration fee for today's session toward your membership fees, so look for a follow-up email from me soon after today's session, and I hope you'll join us. Please, as I said, please stay muted because of the number of participants that we have. It would be a little disruptive if we suddenly had sound coming from various different parts of the world. And if you could, please use the chat function. We will have time at the end of the presentation for questions. So if you have any questions or even just comments, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions or comments you'd like. Before I introduce today's distinguished guest, I'd like to provide a little more background. For the first time this year, we're using a central organizing theme to build out the majority of our event schedule. We're calling it Art versus Artist. Essentially, we're grappling with the question, how do we reconcile the work of an artist with a life and legacy that includes elements which sometimes profoundly challenge our contemporary values? Many of us find this to be a very challenging aspect of appreciating someone's work, whether it's of an artistic nature or even any other major endeavor in life, such as, for example, very recently, politics. You may think of an artist whose work you admire, but who you know to have been a relatively nasty person in real life. And one of the questions you may ask is, how would your perception of their work be affected if they were alive today, if they were a contemporary individual? In the case of Wagner, of course, his notorious anti-Semitism most immediately comes to mind when you ponder this question, but we aim to go deeper beyond that aspect of who Richard Wagner was and delve deeper into the man, his art, and his ever-evolving legacy with this series of conversations. We'd originally planned this as a pair of Art versus Artist seminars for this past fall, but then a nasty virus arrived on our shores a year ago and disrupted everything. Then the murder of George Floyd right here in Minneapolis in May, on May 25th, and the subsequent increased awareness of racial injustice in this country and all around the world only made the Art versus Artist theme seem even more relevant to us. Our conversation series of events this spring, launching with today's discussion of racism in Wagner, will explore those aspects of this theme. And also we're planning to host a panel discussion in the fall to bring everything together in a final comprehensive session. So for today's discussion, we're fortunate to have a very familiar Wagnerian voice, William Berger, who many of you know from his countless appearances as a commentator on the Met Opera broadcasts. Will is a frequent speaker on various opera-related topics, including a number of wonderful and innovative webinar series during the pandemic. And he has written many books, including two specifically on Wagner, Wagner Without Fear, and most recently, Speaking of Wagner, talking to audiences about the Ring of the Nibelung. He is a keen and active supporter of new music in a variety of genres, especially his predominant passion for metal. I could go on and on about Will's diverse interests, but in the interest of time, I'd like to turn it over to Will now. I know you all are muted, but please welcome William Berger.
Hi, Michael. Thank you. And thanks, everybody. I see a lot of familiar names and some new names and some Wagner Society names. And hello to everybody. I did notice, I thought I saw for a moment, Northern California Wagner Society and Terry Stewart. And I had a chance to talk to Terry and the group there this summer on a related topic, not quite exactly the same. And so first of all, it won't be the same thing if you were at that. And the reason it won't be the same thing is because everything's changed since July. In fact, when we did that, there was a Black Lives Matter rally right outside the window here. And that was interesting. That made for an interesting framework to the talk we were having. And now it's February, and just times being what they are, February 2021 is an entirely different issue than July 2020. And therefore, our subject is different. It's like Heisenberg in that way. Observing it has completely changed what it is just by being observed differently, just by being observed. So that brings up the whole idea of, do we have to have this talk? Yes, we do. We have to have it with ourselves, with the general opera world, and with the world beyond that. Do we have to have it again? Yes, because it was different from it's different from the last time we had it. Do we have to have it again now? Yes, because it's really interesting. This is a moment people are going to look back on and say, probably not get it right, but say, what was everybody thinking in 2020, 2021? I was thinking the other day, well, we'll talk about this a little bit. Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg of Wagner takes place very specifically on, what is it, June 23rd and 24th, 1558. 1558 is one of those years that historical operas get written in about. You know what I mean? Don Carlo, or Don Carlos, takes place in 1558. It's one of those years where maybe nobody knew it at the time. I think they did. I think a whole bunch of lots of operas take place in 1558. This is a 1558 moment. If they write historical operas 100 years from now, it'll be about right now. So it's a time to take stock and decide what we're going to do to create it, what comes next. So how is this moment different from what went on before? Well, it's like we learned in The Ring. You can't step in the same river twice. When you hear the Rhine Maiden's music at the very end, it's the exact same music as at the very beginning, and it's entirely different because you're different. I used this example before. Things that were acceptable at one time no longer are. And of course, this is a big problem we come up against. Like, well, but they said it in Gone with the Wind, it's history, and so on and so forth. Well, there's a zone of acceptability. And an example I use is the N-word in the lyrics of The Mikado of Gilbert and Sullivan. Was Gilbert racist? I doubt it. I doubt he was any more racist than the acceptable median zone of what was normal in his time. The zone changed. And I don't care if it's authentic or whatever, you know as well as I do, you simply have to replace that in the Mikado. It cannot be used because it has an effect that is different than what Gilbert intended. So we get into a little bit of the whole idea of what people intended, and that's difficult. And it's difficult with words, and it's really difficult with music, but we have to think about it. Gilbert did not intend for that word to jump out in the audience and derail the whole rest of the opera, because that would be echoing in everybody's head. So you get into this idea of, well, Noam Chomsky calls it transformational grammar. And there was a translation of the scriptures done with transformational grammar. In other words, what could have, judging from the grammar and the morphology, what could they have meant by that word? That's separate from what that word has come to mean. Publish it not in Ashkelon. So on and so forth. Okay, so the zone changes. The zone has changed since Wagner wrote. The zone has changed since we talked about this stuff in the 1950s. I wasn't there, but it was talked about in the 1950s when Wieland Wagner basically resurrected Bayreuth in a non-Third Reich environment, post-Third Reich environment. The zone has changed since then. The zone has changed since July when we were talking about this with Northern California Wagner Society. So the zone changes. We who are, most of us here are, could identify as Wagner fans or willing to become, looking to know more about Wagner, or the people who know the most about Wagner in the world, some of you, not me, I'm talking about you, have been struggling with the whole idea of, like Mike was talking about, the artist and the problems in the art and the problems in the artist, and what do you do with all that? And now that topic that we have been struggling with in a really profound way, I hope, I know I have, for a long time, has become, interestingly, the whole world has become a Wagner debate. And I think that's exciting. I think that that shows we've been doing something right in asking these questions about Wagner. A lot of what I hear people talking about with works like Gone with the Wind and Porgy and Bess and other things sound very familiar to me because of what we have been doing. So the reason we need to have this conversation again now is because we who have been struggling and engaging with Wagner have special points of view to offer the general conversation, and conversely, the general conversation has much to teach us about how we can approach this art that we love so much or are looking to love so much. It works both ways. So what is the problem? Let me start with that, and then I'll get to solutions, I hope. Let's take it apart. The toxicity of Wagner, I call it. It exists in three places, basically, which are in the person, and Wagner, Richard Wagner, a guy who lived at a certain time, and in his biography, his actions. We have that same debate with, say, the founding fathers. How can we look to Jefferson, a slave owner, for notions of freedom? And yet he did articulate some notions of freedom that are still aspirational for us. We're still trying to catch up to Jefferson, whatever. There's the biography, there's the person, the issues in his life. That's one thing. There are the issues in Wagner's writings. You know the writings. 22 volumes of very turgid prose. They're up there somewhere. And then in the works, what's the relation between the three and which are we concerned with? Well, we're concerned with the relations between the three, of course, because we want to know what's in the works. When I say I'm enjoying a Wagner performance, does that mean I'm endorsing the points of view of the person who wrote them? Well, no, I don't think so with someone in the past. I'll get to this, a very complicated topic. I think it is absolutely true. I cannot buy a Ted Nugent album, if I were so inclined, without simultaneously making a statement of endorsement, of empowerment to that person and everything he is advocating. And if you don't know, Ted Nugent is a very toxically outspoken individual in the world today. He was a rock star for 10 minutes 40 years ago. There's a difference if someone's dead. And there is. That's all there is to it. So the biography of Richard Wagner, like Thomas Jefferson, let's leave Jefferson out of it because it works differently. But that's one issue that is not part of our immediate debate. It's part of another one. Also the prose. We don't care about the prose when we attend a Wagner performance. We care about the prose maybe later when we're trying to figure out what, as Wagner says in Parsifal, do you know what you just saw? And as you probably know, if you've read any of the prose, you will know less after you read the prose than you knew before it about the work in question at first. It's a slog, but that's not what's at stake either. What's at stake for us right now is the works on the stage and in recordings. What are they? Are they toxic? I asked the late playwright William Hoffman to write me a blurb for my first book I published, Wagner Without Fear. And he said, no, I'm not doing that because I don't want people to like Wagner the way you do. I think it will be bad for them and bad for the world. And to his credit, I was able to say, no, you're wrong. Listen to me. It doesn't work like that. But I understood his point of view. I just thought it was wrong in that I like this stuff. I'm not a bad person. And it got me thinking in a really deep way about how that could work out. It is the works, the operas, and yes, they are operas, and yes, we will talk about that briefly, that are the issue. Are they toxic? Can we advocate for them? And what do we do? How do we do it? The operas are alive in a way that neither Richard Wagner nor the prose are alive. They evolve in various productions and performances. That's why that's what we argue about. And you know we do. We argue about this production because it didn't say what we want people to hear about this work, especially The Ring of the Nibelung. Singers, well, she didn't capture this, and I don't like a Wotan who's this way instead of that way, and blah, blah, blah. That's the alive part of these works. They're not, are they museum pieces? Maybe, but they come to life. You engage with them. So let's look at that, and I'm going to look again, as we did in the summer, but differently, at two works very briefly, because, come on, they're the two longest works there are. The Ring of the Nibelung and Die Meistersinger von Nuremberg. Because they're two different points of view of what are the issues and how do we deal with them. One being mythological and one being some form of historical realism. As we say, and I learned you could publish any article in Italian if you said at the end of it, in un certo senso, in a certain sense. So in un certo senso, historical realism. The Ring, is it a racist work? Yes, it is. It is about struggles and hierarchies of races. That's what it is. It is nothing but that. That's not true. It's a lot of things also, but in its core, that's what it is. The more you dig, the more you find that that is so, the more you dig into the sources. And we won't fix the problem by denying the problem. Anyone who's ever worked with addiction knows that. It's the struggle of races, and you know that there are all these confusing references in The Ring that are so difficult to unpack, where they talk about two individuals as a race, Geschlecht. Obviously, my favorite word in German to say. Siegmund and Sieglinde are a race, the Volsungs. Fafner and Fasold are a race. Gutrune and Gunther are a race. And I remember when I first started approaching The Rings, why are they talking about races? Well, of course, in the source works and in what we believe are the sources to the source works, which are all oral, pre-written, these are recordings of migrations. This is the age of migrations in Eurasia, 5th century AD, Common Era-ish, fall of the Roman Empire, think, barbarians moving, and so on and so forth. And especially in Northern Europe and Scandinavia, these were not written in any way. There were oral traditions. So there's that whole issue. But the idea, the way the 19th century understood, it's a mythically rich time. Because anytime you have change, great change in world orders like that, you get myth. Think of the fall of Troy. Half of the Greek myths and more than half of the dramas come from that 10-year period of Troy falling and everyone going home to a new world. In this one, in this 5th century-ish time, we have all the King Arthur legends. And half of the other legends in the world come off of the King Arthur legends, including some that Wagner wrote about. So it's about this time of change, time of migrations, and the way the 19th century understood it. This is the best scientific anthropological thinking of the 19th century, was that there had been a race of really strong warriors from Central Asia who moved out in several directions, mostly to India and that way to Northern Europe, and conquered everybody in their path. And these are the famous Aryans you hear about. They didn't exist. Now we understand anthropologically that they did not exist in that way. There was a linguistically united group of people who did migrate and absorbed other populations, which is a very different thing than the way the 19th century understood it, which I always use this metaphor. Did you ever play the board game of Risk? You know, you have all your little colored pieces. I'm going to move into Kamchatka, and you roll the dice and you conquer it and you push everybody else out of the way. You just completely eradicate them, and then you've got your color on that space. That is, well, it's a 19th century game, and that is how they understood that this had happened. It didn't. But so therefore, it is in no uncertain terms a racial issue. And the blonde Aryans, they weren't, but never mind. The blonde Aryans were the top of the pyramid because they were very into understanding this hierarchically. Who were the good races and who were the degenerate races? And the darker you got, the more degenerate in the actual sense of the term you were. Is it an anti-Semitic work? In itself, not directly, but yes, because of this racial hierarchy and the Aryans, the pure blondes on top, therefore make others lesser. You can't have a Herrenmenschen unless you have Untermenschen. You can't have overlords unless you have underlings. So, and in this way, now, of course, knowing what we know from Wagner's biography and his prose, God help us, we can confer that there is anti-Semitism within this structure. But even leaving that aside, We don't need it because, see, now this is a big thing. And this is what I've learned about racism in the last couple of years, just from my point of view, but I also learned it from Wagner. The object specificity of racism is irrelevant. In other words, at whom one is racist. Racism thrives on the process of exclusion. After you've excluded one group, there'll be another. It doesn't matter if Wagner ever said Alberich was the eternal Jew, as many people said they felt Wagner was saying, because inherent in the racial hierarchy of the story of The Ring is Judaism as an Untermenschen group. And if you're an Untermensch, according to Wagner's way of thinking, which we'll see in Meistersinger, you are a problem. To be excluded, maybe not eliminated, as it became in the Third Reich, but excluded. And then I'm thinking of Streicher's phrase, the Jews are our problem. Well, the final solution, one of the problems with the final solution is there is no final solution. If they, and the Third Reich learned that, if they had eradicated all Jews, they still would have needed other Untermensch races to, and they had them, to eliminate, because it's the process. Racism, I have learned through Wagner and history, is a verb, not a noun. It's a thing you do. And you have to have somebody. And it doesn't matter who the somebody is after a while. And I'm thinking of Leo Rosten, great book, The Joys of Yiddish. And he tells the story, I think it was Streicher, it may have been Hitler, but one of them, one of the Nazis, is giving a speech saying Streicher's line, the Jews are our problem. And an old Jew in the crowd says, no, the bicycle makers are our problem. And the Nazi says, why the bicycle makers? And the old Jew says, why the Jews? It's a good old Yiddish story. There's a lot of insight into it. And here's another thing that you can learn from The Ring. You never get rid of Alberich. There is no final solution. Even if you kill him off. And you all know, or you may know, that we don't know what happens to Alberich. We know what happens to every single person in The Ring, except Alberich. And even if he were killed off, along with Hagen at the end there, The Ring is a cycle. There'll be another one. And another one will come to take our jobs and steal our gold and rape our virgin daughters just out of spite and because he hates our happiness. It's the line in The Ring. And if you recognize that language from some of the most toxic voices in politics, I'm talking about, like, you know, some deep QAnon voices, you're right. Because it's the same story. They're out to get you because they hate you because you're happy and beautiful. The gods and their descendants, which the Aryans are thought to be, keep having to fear Alberich, even after there is no Alberich. Okay, so time check. Yikes. Okay. The Ring was an epic created about races, but most epics are, because epics, by definition, are about the founding of a new order. The Aeneid, the Lusiads, Orlando Furioso, how the West was won. Star Wars. Don't get me started. But that doesn't mean it has to be, there are many different answers in the ring to this. The problems of racism in the ring are not literal. They're not in the libretto. They're latent within it. And I believe can be addressed with context, production, performance, discussion like this. That's why, incidentally, little aside, you can't have horned helmets in a production of The Ring today. It's not because it looks corny and old-fashioned. It looks corny and old-fashioned because it's too clearly emblematic of 19th century ideas of racial theory. We know that, of course, the Vikings didn't wear horned helmets, right? But that's not why we can't have it on the stage, because it's historically inaccurate. We are not concerned with historical accuracy in a work that has flying horses and dwarves who sing and sneeze underwater. We are concerned with symbology. And the horned helmets on the gods signify 19th century thought on Aryan supremacy. They still do. You see people wearing them on television today, and they are a white supremacist symbol. The zone of acceptability of the symbol moved under it. There's nothing pernicious about a horned helmet itself. What about Meistersinger? Whoa, I better bring this in quickly. Well, in this opera, you have an entirely different context because, as I say, it is a form of realism. The star, Hans Sachs, was a person who did exist in a place that is familiar, can be visited today. But, you know, it's interesting. I mentioned Don Carlo, my favorite opera, in all its forms. It also takes place in the same year. And it has some interesting things, speaking of historical, because like Meistersinger, it has some things that are wrong. And they're not wrong because Schiller, who wrote the play, thought no one would notice, or Verdi thought no one would notice, especially when he wrote it for Paris. When I remember walking around Paris and seeing the plaque where Henry II died after the famous Juste. He died in a joust accident, which is referred to in the libretto of Don Carlo. So everybody, they say, oh, they say His Majesty is going to take place in a great Juste to celebrate the peace. Well, everybody in the audience in Paris that Verdi wrote it for 200 years after that knew that the king had died in that. They wouldn't have been talking about it later, like, oh, he's going to be... It's weird. And he's drawing, there's no point in that line except to draw attention to the fact, like, well, the history is wrong here. It's weird. And in Meistersinger, you have a similar thing. There's the St. Catherine's Church, which it existed in 1558, but it wasn't where the Meistersinger met. The Mastersingers didn't meet there until about 1620. And Wagner was extremely interested in this opera, in knowing the background. So why would he make a point of saying Act 1 takes place in this church where people in Nuremberg know that it actually didn't? It's interesting. It's like, it's a way of saying, I'm not actually telling history here. Schiller does the same thing in, Maria Stuart, and that we know at the opera, Maria Stuarda, in film from Helen Hayes and all this, Queen Elizabeth and Mary Stuart, we don't think ever met each other. But come on, how are you not going to write that confrontation scene? Either in an opera or a movie or whatever. You can't get at the gist of the story unless you mess with history. In other words, you have to be wrong to be right. So when we talk about Meistersinger has, as historical, we have to remember this is historical. I'm making big quote signs here if you're sight impaired. It's romantic history. It's history as it should have been. And the Church of St. Catherine was a church that, when there was the iconoclasm of the Reformation and works of art were destroyed wholesale, the works of art in the St. Catherine Church were not, because they were so prized as an expression of the people, that when the churches were made to go from Catholic to Lutheran, they took down all the statues and destroyed them. It was a very important part of the process, but not there, because it was seen as something else. And therefore, that church is about the preservation of the best that was old, along with everything good to be had out of innovation together, which is the right story to be telling in Die Meistersinger. It's a story that Wagner is trying to tell. Of course, being Wagner, you can't do it without being toxic. So we have one, Beckmesser. You have to have a bad guy. And there's Beckmesser, who can be very tedious if it's not dramaturgically woven in well. He's the bad guy artistically, and he's the dirty old man who's out to defile our virgin daughters, and with bad poetry. And of course, now very quickly, I just want to take this on. There's Sachs's monologues on racial theory. The problem with them isn't the line everybody points to, do not come at me with this line, obey your German masters, because we know that that out of context does not mean what it means to conquered peoples of Eastern Europe. It means follow your German teachers, which is a great and sublime idea in that way of like take the best of the old and also have new thinking. The problem is in Sachs's whole monologues about their out. Even now, he says, Welcher forces, Welcher. Interesting word. It's what the servants call Octavian Rofrano in Der Rosenkavalier. It actually, I'm told by a German scholar, is related to Guelphs and Ghibellines and that whole nightmare of history. But it means foreigners, it means specifically Italian and Latin foreigners. So it's translated in a now unusable word in old librettos and Rosenkavalier. Whatever on that. But again, it's like, even now, they're lining up to get us. He says, because Wagner, even in Meistersinger, that preaches this combination of tradition and innovation, cannot conceive of a German nation without having bad guys. Beckmesser and Welcher forces. Welcher forces being the Catholic Church, Catholicism, the Latin language, Roman, Italian, French art, which are not unthinkable issues in 1867. They didn't have a map of Germany. And he's like, who are the German people? Well, there's language. As Wagner thought, there was religion. Not that he was any model Lutheran, but he felt that Lutheranism was authentically German in a way Catholicism wasn't. And there's a historical case to be made for that. That same final monologue, famously, of course, speaks of even after the Holy Roman Empire dies, Holy German art will endure. Heilige Deutsche Kunst. So this is either a really wonderful definition of Kunst or a toxic definition of Reich. I don't know. We'll see. But as the Meistersingers say, hier gilt der Kunst. What matters here is art, which is what Wieland Wagner said when he opened up Bayreuth again. He said, I don't want politics, I want art. But that doesn't work anymore. It may have been okay in 1951 when Wieland said it, barely, but the zone changed. That, again, we can't use that line and think we've solved the problem. I'm here for the art, not the politics. No, you're not. As we say in Spanish, and yes, I'm one of those despite the last name, no hay ética sin estética. And I love it in Spanish because it works both ways. There's no ethic without an aesthetic. Every aesthetic has an ethic. Where does this leave us here now? Mostly asking questions. First off, how can I say these works are so right when they're so wrong? Because the truths that we cull from experiencing these works are not literal truths, literally not literal. They're not in the libretto. And most of what happens when these works are analyzed is the libretto is analyzed, not the Gesamtkunstwerk, not the total work of art. Now, hold on. Because I am not saying that the music, the art justifies the politics at all, at all. I will come at you if you say I am saying that. I am saying that the music and the totality of the work is the politics and has to be considered within it. And there can be a difference. And I've come across this. I got to interview Amy Tan and David Henry Hwang for San Francisco Opera for Turandot and Madame Butterfly. And they both made the point that, like, when you read the libretto or the synopsis of Madame Butterfly, she reads like a victim, a passive Asian, the worst stereotypes, absolutely consumed by her encounter with American masculinity. When you attend the opera and you hear the score and you hear her music at the moment where she chooses the suicide, she is no victim. She is clearly, within the framework of the opera, the victor, the moral victor. Suicide is often a victory in opera. It's often the morally superior choice. Brunhilde. Brunhilde at the end of the Ring, her suicide is not a victim. Boy, that's some victim. 17-minute aria in the spotlight. That's not, in opera, that isn't what happens to victims. That's what happens to the only agent of evolution in the entire story. So the truth is not literal. Brunhilde kills herself. Yeah, but there's more to it. It's complicated, as the kids say. Real quickly, the Divine Comedy is a very important book. It's a thing I've studied a lot of Dante. And the Divine Comedy, in the cosmography, as Dante saw it, the Earth is at the center of the solar system, and then comes Mercury and Venus, and then the Sun, and then Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, and that's it. That's wrong. Don't give me flat Earth stuff. That's wrong. And yet, there are scientific insights in Dante's cosmography that were not understood until after Einstein published both theories of relativity. Space is curved happens in the Paradiso of Dante. That after you leave the sphere of Saturn, there's another sphere, the primum mobile, and then after that is the place without time and space. What? And there are articles. I took my astrophysicist brother and me, with my degree in Italian Lit, an entire summer sitting down to read this article in Scientific American about astrophysics and Dante, but we didn't. It was like, you can be wrong and be true, as the Italians understand in opera. Se non è vero è ben trovato. Truth and fact are two different things. And a lot of examples there. Let me move on. What's the solution? I don't know. But I have some ideas. Okay. Love the art, hate the artist isn't going to work. Nope. That's not enough. It perhaps was evolutionary. Doesn't work now. Cancel Wagner. Sorry, isn't going to happen. It's too good. Sorry, Bill Hoffman. You should rest in peace. It's not going away. We can't deny the problem anymore, trivializing it. We can't trivialize it by saying, well, for example, I'm not Jewish, but saying, well, I'm Jewish, so it's okay. And I listen to it. That was a great statement when Hermann Levy made it in 1883, but not anymore. Hier gilt der Kunst, nope. What has been tried and worked a little? Well, there's the issue of race-blind casting, which, again, in 1961, Grace Bunbury and Bayreuth, that was a big issue. The Schwarze Venus, remember? Excuse me. It didn't solve the problem, but it was a start. Toscanini's idea, and James Levine and others, of I'm going to take this and not let the bad guys own it. That was something. That was evolutionary. Didn't fix the problem. It was good. What can be done now? Okay. What are actual steps? Morris Robinson, who's a good friend of mine, has been talking everywhere about there is no innocuous racism. And I believe that's a thing that I'm saying about it. It's not about anti-Semitism, it's about exclusionism. Racism anywhere has to be confronted. So once it's identified, that's half the problem. And confronting, it won't go away then. It's like tooth decay. It doesn't go away on itself. Idris Elba suggested warning labels. I didn't think that was a great idea, but I like that he's thinking about that. He was talking about Gone with the Wind, that it needed a warning label. And I don't know if it needs, like, this is going to cause cancer, like a pack of cigarettes, but it needs a contextualization. What can we do? Let me get to this. One, let's welcome the debate and not fear it. The debate won't shrink the art we love, it will augment it. I saw the Met hired a diversity officer, which I think is a very interesting development. I know, never read the comments. You really don't want to read the comments on social media about that move from people, from opera fans. I made it through about one page and I quit a few groups. It may or may not be a good idea, but it's not to be feared with the sort of, I would say, fear-based reaction that I saw people posting. One person called me and said, is this going to mean bad casting? Like, are we going to cast people for racial origin instead of for who's going to sing it best? And I said, no, I don't think so. That's a fair question, but that's not what's going on here. I think we also, and this is something I have talked about and could talk about at length, but I'll just bring it home here. I think we need, when we here talk about, well, I'm here for the art and so on, what we mean is, or what needs to happen to make that topic work is that we need to reframe what art is in our country. And especially in our very utilitarian country, you know, listen to Mozart, it'll make your baby smart. It's like, well, it may make your baby smart, but the reason to play Mozart to your baby is not to get a reward at the end. The reason is because Mozart's great and you want to give your baby the best stuff. That's an end in itself. It doesn't have to pay a dividend later. It will, but it doesn't. That's not the way to justify it. And I'm always complaining about, you know, why is it arts and leisure in the New York Times? Why is art this thing you do in your spare time after you've done the real man's work of banking and investing and sports? Isn't art the form of ideas? Thomas Hampson once told me the laboratory of human experience he found at the opera. I don't know why he said laboratory, but he did. But I love the idea. Isn't art the thing that you do first and then all your investing and sports what you do later once you've thought about why things are? I have a lot to say about that, but I think that's important, an important part of this. When we're talking about, racism in the arts, it's like, well, what is art? And we need to make that case, that art is central to our politics, to our civilization. The Greeks knew that. The Greeks, upon whom the entire institution of opera is supposedly based, and certainly Wagner, according to Nietzsche, they knew that the arts were the forum that defined the politics, not the other way around. We need to advocate for that. I said earlier that, I'll wrap this up, that racism, we learn from both The Ring and from history, particularly that of the Third Reich and the failure of the final solution, is a thing that never ends. It has to keep excluding. This is why we have to talk about seemingly abstract issues in art of a century and a half ago, because we're not talking about abstract issues in art of a century and a half ago. We're talking about a process, an ongoing process, a living process. Racism, as I said, is a verb, not a noun. We're talking about racial and demographic issues in our lives today. And that's why we can't avoid talking about it. And that's why we don't want to avoid talking about it. We shouldn't be afraid about it, because it makes a bigger stage for the art we love, not a smaller one, which is the fear. They need what we know, they need our point of view of what we know from Wagner in the general conversation. And we who love Wagner need other people's points of view, maybe points of view of people we don't see very often in our audiences, maybe points of view of people we don't see very often here now. Why? Not to be right, not to be cool, certainly not to be PC. Does anybody even say that anymore? Don't. It's not to have cancel culture. It's because we need bigger points of view. There are more people now. We need to augment the scale of Wagnerian and operatic and art in general in order to maintain the same percentage in the world that it had. We need to grow audiences to have the same percentage of audience as we've always had. And we are impoverished unless we do that. They are impoverished if they don't have our point of view of what we've learned from Wagner. And we are impoverished if we don't have the points of view of people who have never spoken about Wagner. We need it. That's why. We need it to survive into whatever comes after this 2021 world, which is 1558 and 1918 and all that. And they need our point of view because it's really profound, because Wagner was really profound as an artist. We know toxicity. We've seen it in action. We know where it leads. We've seen the end of the world. We know what to do to make it not happen. I should shut up at that moment. So, Michael, are you there?
I am here. I am here.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
Where are we?
We still have a full slate of folks on. If anyone has questions, I think we could probably safely, if you want to unmute yourself, you don't need to use the chat, but feel free to ask a question or make a comment.
Be gentle. Actually, bring it on. I'm used to this. I talk about Wagner all the time, so shock me. It's not Wagner that makes people ask intense questions. It's Tosca. I've had chairs thrown at me at Tosca talks.
That's interesting.
It's just that kind of work.
Now I'm curious to know what caused that, what triggered that.
I have a lot to say about Tosca.
One thing that I had, a note that I had taken was that I've always been a bit curious about Wagner's use of the opposition of light and dark in the Ring. And there are many, many aspects of that that I can think of.
Licht Alberich.
Lichtalberich and Schwarzalberich, yeah.
Schwarzalberich.
Yeah, and the fact, yeah, that I mean, there aren't very many references to Wotan as Lichtalberich, but that is his, he's sort of a doppelganger of Alberich's, right?
Yeah.
In a sense.
Yeah, the Ring starts making sense when, at that moment, when you realize, oh, remember, did you ever see Das Barbecue?
Yes.
Remember Alberich and Wotan do a song and dance together? It's not, but almost will always be bosom buddies, like the frenemies, the original frenemy. They exist in definition to each other, like Welcher and Deutsch, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't have the one without the other. You know, one thing that I didn't say is that the real reason to talk about these things, to welcome dialogue about these things, San Francisco Opera has, LA Opera has open town halls about these issues in really good ways. I've been at some. It's to save this. The object of the oppression will survive. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that. He said that the real tragedy, historically speaking, of the Third Reich is the effect it will have on non-Jewish Germans. He said the Jews will survive outside of here. But all the great virtues of German culture, like, you know, perseverance and hard work and discipline and all that, those will be forever tainted. And it's the same thing here and it struck me, you know, Brünnhilde in The Immolation never mentions Alberich. She's performing her sacrifice. She's addressing Wotan the whole time. Rest. And she says, I love it. She says, now I understand everything. And she repeats it 3 times. Alles, alles, alles. I know everything. And that it's the problem with the Ring was not Alberich. The problem is the corruption that it unleashed on Wotan and the gods. And I think it's the same, we can look at it the same way here. The problem with racism in these works and in presenting them is not in the effect they will have on the races, it's the self-rot that it has. And it's amazing because, again, if you look hard enough, the answer is actually in the Ring. Anyway. Light and dark, yeah. We have to remember that, you know, Wagner was conflicted about the relative merits of light and dark. Because then there's that whole Tristan thing. And, you know, it's light, it's dark, I'm light, I don't know what I am. I'm in the middle, and that's the whole fun of it. Yeah. So duality was always a problem with Wagner. It's complicated, and that's a good thing.
If anyone has any questions that they want to ask through the chat, you can do that as well. You don't need to necessarily unmute yourself if you prefer the chat. We're monitoring the chat. So if anybody has any questions, comments.
It is not possible that there are no questions on this topic.
Everything is clear as mud.
What about you, Mike? What are you saying? Well, now wait a second. There must be something.
No, it's an interesting discussion. I think that we have, it is, I think that for me, the answer is that there is so much truth in The Ring, of course, is the work I keep returning to, because it is so gargantuan, and it does seem to be so comprehensive. My immediate thought when someone asked me, well, what is there really racism in Wagner? I felt like my immediate response was, well, there's pretty much everything in Wagner. And it's so comprehensive, and yes, there are toxic aspects of it, but there are also so many things that are amazing, just frankly amazing.
You know, yeah, it's vast. It's like scripture.
Hmm.
Seek and you shall find. I heard a great sermon. It's like, you know what that means? That means if you want to find justification for something, you'll find it
Mhm.
in something that big. Seek and you shall find, including its own opposite. The point is that the intention and the morality of the person who created it is a separate conversation from the thing itself. That does not mean that the art is entirely free of the artist or whatever, but they are two different conversations in the fact that the artist does not always know what he or she is saying. That it is not like going to Dante again. It is not always possible to know as much as they suggested. One person could not have known all the footnotes in the Divine Comedy. And when I say you can find something about, yes, everybody should be blonde and Aryan, you can find that in The Ring, and you can find with Brunhilde, no, that's not how it goes at the same time. And we have to be aware of those choices we make in productions, in performance, in discussion of The Ring. And I think that's very important. It's all there. It's whatever you want to find in something that big. There's
So
also
this,
Lohengrin. You know, I mean, there's Lohengrin and Parsifal. There are others, but I just chose these two because they're the biggest points of view on this issue of who are we anthropologically, and two different mirrored point of views, the mythological and the pseudo-historical.
Yeah, I have a question, Michael. This is Laura McCartan.
Hi, Laura.
Hi, Bill. Thank you for the talk. It's given me something to think about. Can you share any opinion you have about recent productions that maybe exacerbated this whole thing that we grapple with in terms of how does the piece stand on its own, you know, relative to the intention of the composer, and then take the intention of a director or the creative person behind a production. So any thoughts you have around that?
Yeah, lots of thoughts. Usually that's what I talk about in talks, are productions and the politics in them. One thing I'll say is that, building off what I just said about it's all there, any point of view is there, I think you have to take a point of view. I think saying that you're just being completely abstract and apolitical is unacceptable, and of course is a point of view and not a good one. So I do believe you have to take one. How do you do that in a way that shows us the value of the work, or a way of approaching value in the work, as opposed to a way of the production justifying itself? That's a good question, because I know I buckle, and I'm sensing that you do too, just from the wording you're using, Sometimes when productions go out of their way to say, we don't approve of the racism in Wagner, it doesn't seem to help. It seems to limit rather than augment the scope of the work. Am I right that there is that going on in your perception, Laura?
Well, I guess it really wasn't coming from that point of view. No,
Okay.
but you're giving me something else to think about. So that's
that one's there.
yeah.
But what I think about is I think that you have to have a point of view. And you have to, I need to know that you know the ring is about big, big, big questions of who we are as a species. And if you don't convince me that you know that, I'm not going to like your contextualizing of the work, which is what you're doing with the new production. But to do that well is very difficult. And to do that well in 1951 and 2021 are two different things, Wieland Wagner and today. And to do that well in Germany or Brazil or Seattle or Thailand or any number of places, or Russia that produce rings, they're all different. And those cultural filtrations should be factored in when we say, well, you know, this goes on all the time, especially with people in a Wagner society. Oh, those Eurotrash productions. Well, sometimes we have to look at why is it necessary in Germany to present dehistoricized productions in a way that it may not be as necessary in the United States. Do you know what I mean? Why can't you have Lohengrin right in a suit of shining armor in Germany? Well, a lot of reasons. Maybe you can in America. Maybe, I don't think you can, but maybe. But if you do, the point being, Heisenberg again, the point being that if you have one production in America, the majority of the people who are seeing it are seeing a different thing. They're turning it into a different thing than the people in Europe would be turning it into. That they would see instantly, wait a second, these are the aesthetics of the Third Reich. In a way that we would see that. So I think that has to be factored in too. That if it's a cultural issue on stage, there are issues of cultural filtration on how it's perceived over time and place.
Just
And I
one
don't think
follow,
we talk about that enough. Please.
just final follow-up question. Do you find that Wagner it carries more burden in that cultural filtration than other operas or other composers?
Yes, I think it all carries it. And I think there's a mistake I think that because Wagner weighs so much, the issues are weightier. And they're not weightier, they're more apparent. However, and thank you for bringing this up, and I've said this a bunch of times, I think there's a danger in making Wagner the only person that we have to talk about this stuff with. And I hope I made that clear. It's like, this is a springboard for all opera, all art, because there's a great danger, you know, I talk about this, that like, you know, Wagner and Verdi are the bad cop and good cop of opera. And that just does a disservice to both of them, to their humanity. That, yes, we need to talk about gender issues, which are the same topic and not, but go along with it. And we need to talk about it in Wagner because we need to talk about it everywhere. But there's a lot to be gained in framing the conversation by talking about it maybe first with Wagner, but not exclusively. Yes, and thank you for that. We get that a lot. It's like people who, well, I know I'm not supposed to like Wagner because he was like a Nazi or something, right? And it's like, yeah, no, that won't work. That won't work because then it's okay for you to like everything else uncritically. No. This should be the thing that makes you have to approach everything critically, not to give you a get out of jail free card. I think that's very important.
There was a question that overlaps a little bit, but since it has a, it came through the chat, it has a specific director referenced. I thought I'll read the question verbose. What about the role of stage directors and the responsibility for interpretation of the operas? I'm thinking of Barry Kosky and the way he confronts the toxicity of Die Meistersinger head on while being fully aware of context and never losing the beauty of the work.
I don't know that production. I should. I've read a lot about it, but I don't want to be one of these people who talks about a production from having read about it. But I love that that's what his intention was for that, because I think that's exactly what it's all about. Now it's really weird because, I mean, what's going to be cloying for one person in the audience is going to be a revelation for someone else. So that's really hard. I mean, there are times when I want to say to a director, okay, I get it. I get what you're saying here. You know, and this comes up with gender issues even more, like, you know, oh, you think that abusing and oppressing women is bad. Okay, I get it. Sometimes the way that that is telegraphed to me in productions where it's over, in my estimation, overdone, like sort of, you know, well, there are instances in Ring productions of Brunhilde being raped, although in one that I could think of it actually worked very well, but sort of, and raped by several people. That could be for one person in the audience a revelation, and another person, I might see that as you're trying to put it down, but actually I think you're reveling in it a little too much. You know, so it's really, really hard to make statements on the stage that will land in the audience the way you intended them to as a stage director. I'm here to tell you, as a radio person, we are Mary Jo Heath and I are constantly reminding each other, it doesn't matter what you say. It matters what they hear. And that's a blow to my ego, man. I got to tell you that right away. It's like, but I already said, doesn't matter. In talks, when people say, so what you're saying is the art matters, not the artist, or the politics don't matter. It's like, no, that's exactly not what I'm saying. But you can only control so much about how people receive the information you put out. So when a director is trying to tell me, I think Brunhilde is treated very badly as a human being, or as a well, at the end, she's a human being. What will tell me that and what will tell you that and that one that are three different things. That's a big problem in directing. And it takes a really good director to have any point of view be part of the narrative. To be like Barry Kosky, whatever he did, if that's what people are talking about, well, in this Meistersinger, he was doing this. That speaks to his abilities as a director. And definitely with Meistersinger, I have to know you have a point of view. Because are you telling me there's a sublime union of tradition and innovation, or are you telling me exclusionary ideals of German racial destiny? They're both there.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
This is Laura again. If there's no one else has a question, I just wanted to note, I never thought I'd hear a reference to Ted Nugent in a Wagner talk, so that was fun, and I share your opinion of him, but I think you're also a guitar enthusiast because I see the poster behind you, on the wall behind you. Who is that?
This is an interpretation by an artist friend of mine. He has, it's Rick James done as an Iron Maiden cover.
Oh, that's fantastic. It looks like he's playing.
Wait, he has Celine Dion too. I have the T-shirt, but I'm plugged in. I can't go get it. And you know, it's interpretation and point of view. As every time we revisit a work of art, we're giving it a new spin. So yeah, that's that. No, you know, an example I used this summer was sometimes you can Slayer. Sometimes you can't say, you know what, you're wrong. I don't like what you said politically. And I have ways of saying that. They're not going to hear it, but whatever. But yes, I do want to. I attended every one of their concerts until the last one. There are ways of doing it, but it involved interacting. It involved being obnoxious, raising your voice and saying, no, you're wrong about that. But there are degrees. There is a zone of acceptability. The zone moves, narrows, and changes. I was able to say, yeah, all right, here, take my ticket money, even though, you know, really stop with the Confederate flag thing. I'm not feeling it. Okay. And I choose not to with others. So yeah, it's about identifying the zone and what your role in it.
Terrific. Are there any other questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, Will.
Thank you, Michael. I'm concerned I wasn't sufficiently controversial. Nobody threw a chair. We'll have to talk about Tosca sometime.
Yeah. All right. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And our next conversation is with Christine Gerke.
Oh, well, if that's the best you can do.
On March 29th. And I don't know what she'll have to share with us, but she's, if you've ever heard Christine speak, she's wonderful to talk to. And I hope you can join us. I will be sending out an email with information about our upcoming events and when you can register fairly soon here. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful Sunday or Monday if you're in Sydney. Take care.